We had some technical difficulties, but I am going to put those aside for right now. All right. So hi, everybody. It's great to have everyone back. Here we are. It is the first installment of our cultural workshop and cultural affairs series. So we're really happy to be here and happy to have everybody back. We have a really exciting semester in front of us. And I will say, so first off, I'm Joanna Woronkowicz. I'm one of the faculty directors for the Center for Cultural Affairs. And I'm joined here by my colleagues. You can introduce yourself, Doug.
Hey, hi, I'm Doug Noonan, and welcome to everybody. This is our 5th year of doing this online workshop. So I'm glad to see it. Everyone's coming back and the momentum is building.
Absolutely. And then our program manager, Becca Keogh, is here, and she is the one that has been reminding everybody and setting the schedule, and will be facilitating the workshop today. So we're having a little bit of a different series this semester, and actually next semester as well, or this year. Part of what we're doing is also doing a soft book launch for a book that we just released called Innovating Institutions and Inequities in the Arts, that we released this summer with Palgrave Macmillan. Thank you, Doug. And so we're going to be having presentations from our authors every other workshop. And we're going to start today with a presentation on the chapter that me and Doug wrote, followed by Carole Rosenstein. So we are going to just give it a go. We'll talk for about 15 minutes, and then we will have about 10 minutes of discussion, and then we'll move to Carole's presentation. She'll present for about 15 minutes, and then we will end the workshop with discussion. So a little bit of a different format than what we're usually used to. So I'm going to go ahead and start, and hopefully I'm going to get to the right screen because I have about 1 billion screens up. Excuse me. Oh, hold on a second. Sorry. Okay. Can you see there? Is everything good? Okay, great. Okay, so our chapter actually starts off the book, and I'm going to share some information about the book as well. But Doug, do you want to get us going?
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, we start off the book. Again, this big topic about innovating institutions, inequities in the arts. So we're combining 3 big I words together with inequities, institution, excuse me, and innovation. And so we wanted to set the stage with this with our intro chapter. And so for that, we end up talking quite a bit about each of these big I's. And we wanted to help turn our attention, not just about innovations and inequities, but see them through the lens of the institutions that themselves are managing those innovations, or themselves are innovative institutions. So that's our initial part of this. That's the goal here, is for us to highlight these major institutions that are influencing inequities and inequalities in the arts sector. Joanna, is there a way to go to the next slide, the next page?
Sure. And I think, can you see my slides? Can you see my whole screen?
We've got the slide looks good right there as it's going.
Great.
So, throughout here, we're talking with inequities about unequal distribution of income and opportunity between different groups in society. The key part here, especially for this kind of audience, is to emphasize what we mean by institutions. Here, we're not talking about institutions as large, old arts organizations. We're not referring, the Met as an institution. Here, we're thinking more broadly about humanly devised constraints that structure how we interact amongst each other. So you could have the institutions can be arts organizations, or the entire nonprofit system, or the institution of the rule of law, or market capitalism. These are all sorts of institutions. They can be rather big or small in terms of their scope. But these are the institutions are what provide the incentive structure for these operators and agents in the economy and throughout to be acting. It's the structure evolves. These aren't necessarily static. Some institutions end up taking a smaller role over time as other institutions come to the fore. So things like the internet and how it moderates streaming services, or the gig economy and online web platforms become institutions themselves that would have been unheard of a generation ago. So these are parts of the big pieces, the big pictures of institutions and how they interact with inequity and inequality in society as we see innovations come online. And that's our initial framing for all of this. Hand it off to Joanna then.
Okay, so moving ahead. So the first institution that we talk about here is that of the marketplace. So again, this gives the idea that these are more than just organizations, but these are kind of major systems that are providing incentives and disincentives for the actors that are involved. So this marketplace is where producers and consumers are interacting around the exchange of goods. This idea of a good we use in terms of it's basically just a service or a product. So in the arts, those goods are the performances and exhibits that take place, the products that an artist creates, etc. There's a lot of discussion about what a good actually is, or what kind of good an arts good is. So are they ordinary goods? And these are ordinary goods are typical to most of the goods that we probably experience in the marketplace, like ketchup, right? So demand decreases with increases in price. Are they merit goods? Oh, sorry, one moment. Are they merit goods? So something like education would be a merit good. And this is a good that society sees as more beneficial than what most consumers are actually willing to pay for them. So you can already see the implications on equity here. In the case of merit goods, who really gets to decide what goods are good for society? Are they status goods? Or so sometimes we call these luxury goods. So this is where demand increases with price. So you can imagine a painting and the value of that painting actually increasing with the price, or the attractiveness of the painting increasing with the value or the price of it sold at auction. So the very nature of these goods has implications for inequities, since then there are status goods where demand actually increases with price. So this is, again, sort of the painting example. So the very nature of these goods has implications for inequities because their consumption depends actually on their inaccessibility. Then there are also what we call club goods, and these are defined actually by some form of exclusivity. So there's a great paper that we cite in the chapter that looks at performing arts as a club good. So here actually inequity is baked into the form of the good. So some people, though, believe that the arts are a public good. And the idea of a public good, I'm sure we're all familiar with, is that they can be consumed by one person without diminishing the amount that remains for others. And so that's what we call a non-rivalrous good. And that there's also no way to exclude anyone else from benefiting from consuming the good and once that good is produced. So this is what we call non-excludable. So we can think of course, water and air as our pure public goods. But the implication of a good being a public good is that we can't actually expect that the good can be produced optimally in the marketplace. So there's some kind of market failure that takes place that requires government intervention and many of the times subsidy. So this gets into this idea about the arts possibly being public goods. Just thinking about this as an example, so what are those implications on inequities in the arts sector when we think of the arts as a public good? Well, let's take a couple of examples. So if the arts are a public good, then we have some people paying for them more, some people paying more than others, and some people having more or less access to the good. So in other words, the burden of the payment is not equal across the people who have access to the arts, and also payments is not necessarily proportional to those who can access the good. So there are obvious inequities that come about with the arts being a public good. So let's think about, for example, the arts being funded through something like cigarette taxes, which many of our local arts agencies use in order to fund the arts. This puts a burden on those who smoke to pay for the arts, even though we know that smoking is negatively correlated with income, and that income is actually positively correlated with arts attendance. So that shows that the burden and the access distribution isn't necessarily proportional, and there's an inequity. Relatedly, the level of one's resources is also strongly related to being able to access the arts. And even if in theory the arts are non-excludable, even if in theory they are a public good. So let's think about many of our arts organizations in major cities. There are major cities that are very expensive to live in, very expensive to visit, making access to these organizations challenging for people who can't afford to visit or live in these cities. So again, the idea of the arts as a public good and the arts operating in this marketplace actually naturally results in inequities that then the arts sector ends up thinking about how to address. And I'll move it to you, Doug.
Okay.
Oh, actually, no, this is me. Oh, we did not practice, eh? So the second institution we talk about in the chapter is that of what we call superstar economies. And these are economies that are defined by a small number of people who earn enormous amounts of money and then dominate the activities in which they engage. So that's the very formal definition. But you can think of a couple of examples that we all probably know about. So think of Taylor Swift in the pop music market. Think of Tom Brady in football. So these people proportionally earn a huge amount of income in their industries, but they don't necessarily have disproportionate levels of talent. Now, maybe that's debatable, but there's obviously other examples that we can point to if you don't agree with Taylor Swift or Tom Brady. So the main characteristic here in the superstar economy is actually inequity in itself, right? It's that very small differences in talent translate into huge differences in income. So the institution of a superstar economy is actually by nature an inequity. So there are lots of reasons that superstar economies exist, many having to do with inequities in the sector, these inequities that naturally exist in the sector. First, talent is very, very heterogeneous across producers, right? So everybody has different levels of talent, first of all, but talent is also really, really hard to identify in the sector, in the arts. So these inequities across producers in the form of talent make it such that consumers are willing to pay for really, really high quality artists. In other words, because it's really hard to identify who is talented and who is not, when there is something of high quality, people are willing to pay a lot for it, and inequities result. So furthermore, inequities in terms of who can both acquire the skills needed to succeed in the arts, so who can get the training, who can get the networking experience, et cetera, and then ultimately who gets noticed, are often due to things like social advantage. So there are people who do get noticed and make it big, but they often come from backgrounds and experiences that make it easier for them to succeed in the arts. And there's also there's a good deal of literature that shows that this type of privilege or this type of socioeconomic advantage helps people get ahead, not only in the arts, but in other industries as well. And then finally, there's this thing that we call psychic income. This is a term economists mainly use to explain kind of the intrinsic reasons that people engage in certain forms of work, or maybe the non-tangible or non-pecuniary benefits to work. But this psychic income that many relate to working in the arts sector or working in creative fields makes it such that people continue to work in this field in the arts, even if they don't get monetarily rewarded. So in effect, this is helping preserve the superstar market or the superstar economy that is by nature in itself inequitable. All right, now I'll move it to you, Doug.
Okay, so this next little bit, just under the big header here of the ubiquity of monopolies, is my attempt to point us to another set of institutions that can drive a lot of inequities we see across the arts sector. And part of the story about monopolies is not just about sort of Disney as this massive monolithic mega corporation that exerts monopoly power, the Googles of the world. It's actually more about what we refer to as a natural monopoly. And this naturalness is a result of the market actually only being able to sustain one producer in that market of this type. It's hard to imagine having a dozen different symphonies running in your local market and being able to see all 12 of them survive financially. At best, the market's able to support just one of these. And if a second one entered the market and competed, it would drive both to ruin. And so we have a case where quite often in our arts sector, we can only support a single firm or a single producer to provide for that market. And without much competition there, we run into a second problem, which is endemic to these natural monopolies, where much of the arts sector production ends up having or being characterized by really high fixed costs, high startup costs, high capital costs, high costs for the stage and all the props and all this. But on a per audience member or a per performance basis, the actual additional costs are pretty small once you've paid for the set and the building and all the parking. One more ticket, one more seat in the audience doesn't add much to the costs. And in a world where you've got high fixed costs and low marginal costs, we tend to produce these things called natural monopolies. They work a bit like our public utilities. And while we might have natural monopolies in things like IT provision and internet and cable TV back in the olden days and things like that, we can see this is pretty common throughout the arts sector. And it can be a big problem as technology is advancing and some of the other pieces of the production side, like labor, is hard to make efficiency gains. And that's where we could bring in this thing called the cost disease. So next slide. Some of the big implications of all of this arise with respect to inequities is that first thing we know about monopolies, in order to have them work, function, and be like a monopoly, they tend to restrict access. They tend to not be about making things cheap for all. It tends to be pretty privileged, pretty elite sort of access to a few with restricted output and higher prices. And we need those high prices to cover those high fixed costs. So at some level, it makes sense, but on other levels, it directly contributes to inequities. Also, it puts monopolies in a position to reduce or push for lower compensation to workers. So much of the arts sector with monopolistic behaving suppliers tend to be characterized by pretty bad wages for those interns, reliance on volunteer labor, and a lot of other really low compensation things. It helps to be the only game in town. You get away with those kinds of bargaining power positions. And also in general, a lot of these natural monopolies are essentially the gatekeepers. They're the owners of the fixed capital. And it gives a lot of power to these gatekeepers. And it puts a bigger disconnect between the creator and the paying audience with a gatekeeper in the middle. Other things we see coming from natural monopolies and monopolies across the board, they tend to practice a lot of price discrimination. They tend to give elite access to those who are willing to pay a lot extra, and they get a special version of the good, and everyone else is left with the leftovers. We also see a lot of product differentiation. And this is an interesting case where much of the arts sector is characterized by creators trying to craft their own unique brand and demonstrate their unique talent and essentially give it so that they're unique. There are no competitors. They are one of a kind, and the practice of constantly striving to carve out monopolies. So I'm going to bring this bit to a close here by saying we've picked on things like monopolies and superstar economics and so the public good nature of the arts sector to point out that there are some fundamental institutions and fundamental forces at play there that lead to a great deal of inequity and inequality around the arts sector. But this is not just the criticism of these institutions and what they generate. It's more of an attempt to appreciate why we have them. They're not there for no good reason. They serve functions. Natural monopolies and pricing things the way they are tends to be necessary in order to cover those fixed costs. You take that away, you don't have the fixed costs covered, you don't have the production. It doesn't happen. So when we start thinking about what are the other pieces, what are the other innovations, what are the other things we could be doing differently, what kind of reforms and revolutions need to take place, we want to just remind the readers throughout this chapter to think of these alternative institutions and whether they're going to be solving all the problems or creating new ones in their place. Entirely possible. And we end with a little bit of recommendation to think of more incremental, perhaps, than revolutionary approaches to innovating in the arts sector so that we can muddle our way through and address the inequalities that arise, not all of which are intentional, but are often a side effect of trying to solve other more fundamental problems.
Okay, so this is the chapter that starts off, and it's meant to give a framing. So before we move to Carole's, I think it's sort of good to know that all of the other chapters that come into this book start to, I think, interact with a lot of what we're talking about in this initial chapter and talking about the specific inequities on the ground and then potential innovations to address those inequities. Little QR code here if you're interested in the book. And then also, if you are interested in the book, oh, that's the wrong one. There is and I can share this with everybody, but it's a 20% off type of thing that our Palgrave Macmillan Press sent us in case you are interested, and I can share that with the rest. So I'm going to stop here. And if there are any questions or any comments or anything on what you've seen, we can take about 10 minutes before we move on to Carole's presentation. All right.
And I'm glad to know that there's a copy in Budapest.
Yes, then thank you, Attila. That's wonderful to know.
We will have a chance after Carole goes, and we'll do a similar thing for Carole in her chapter. We'll have a chance at the very end to bring everything together for both as well.
Yeah. So why don't, since there's not many questions right now, why don't we just move to Carole's presentation, and then we'll reserve the last 15 to 20 minutes or so for our discussion.
Great. Thanks so much.
Great.
Yep. Thank you. So you all can see me now, see the slide?
No.
Wait, all right. Let me see. I gotta share. Now you can.
Perfect.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. So the material that I'm presenting today is from a chapter co-authored by myself, along with Murray Kim and Neville Vicaria of Drexel. And Murray is from George Mason, like myself. So respect and thanks to my two co-authors. And much of what I'm going to do is just summarize what you will find throughout the chapter and then highlight one of our findings. So I will be reviewing what the chapter actually includes. So this chapter is framed by Foucault and Collins on the relationship between statistical data, governmentality, and domains of power. So we start out the chapter with that theoretical lens on just thinking about why statistical data are important and how they relate to governmentality. Now, using this Foucauldian lens, we discuss the history of the development of the nonprofit data infrastructure in the US, which was built using data supplied by the IRS, of course. It required sectoral comparison, and it privileged the conceptualization of the nonprofit sector as business-like. And in result, the nonprofit data infrastructure institutionalizes a particular point of view. In that point of view, the most important way of assessing nonprofit organizations is by looking at their economic scale and impacts, finances, and financial viability. That point of view has tended to entail ignoring small organizations in most nonprofit data and research. So this will be a review or an overview for many of you who are quite familiar with the IRS Form 990 data, but I found even in doing the research for this chapter that the reminder of exactly where all the lines are drawn right now was actually very helpful. So I hope you find it to be so as well. So in the business master file, the IRS holds data on all incorporated nonprofit organizations that register for federal recognition of their tax-exempt status. Of course, organizations register using the Form 1023, where they provide basic information such as name, address, EIN, web address, officers, and a 250-character description of tax-exempt purpose, as well as a proposed NTEE classification. So once having registered, organizations then report annually to the IRS. Now, before 2008, organizations with gross receipts less than $25,000 were not required to file annual returns. So for the smallest organizations, the IRS held only information from the Form 1023, that registration form. In 2008, the agency adopted new reporting requirements for the smallest nonprofits. After 2008, all organizations with gross receipts more than $5,000 were required to file a 990N or e-postcard, and organizations that failed to file for 3 consecutive years are subject to loss of their tax-exempt status. These changes resulted in almost 500,000 new filings. So it's important to note how many organizations out there were not in the file at all before and were now included. Then in 2011, the IRS raised the threshold for filing the 990N to $50,000. So organizations with annual gross receipts between $25,000 and $55,000 previously required to file a longer iteration of the Form 990 no longer were required to do so. And after 2011, those organizations could file a postcard instead. And these two changes resulted in a great expansion in the number of organizations that are treated as very, very small. They typically have annual revenue between $5,000 and $50,000. In fact, currently, very, very small organizations make up the great majority, an estimated 65% of organizations in the Business Master File. Yet the smallest nonprofits, along with a range of other organizations that do not tend to show up in IRS data at all, are ignored in most quantitative research on nonprofits and the nonprofit sector. One justification for ignoring small nonprofits has been that these organizations have minimal economic impact on the sector. And here's where we start to see that structural point of view coming into play. Another is that researchers have tended to view the IRS as a weak source of information about the smallest organizations. Of course, financial data about larger organizations that are required to file a full Form 990 are more robust than financial data about smaller organizations that are not required to do so. However, there is useful data about even the smallest nonprofit organizations pulled from the Form 1023 and supplemented annually since the introduction of the postcard, the 990N, with a report that the organization remains active and that its gross receipts continue to fall below the $50,000 threshold. The critical problem with these data is that neither the IRS nor NCCS, the National Center for Charitable Statistics, has targeted sufficient resources toward their cleaning and maintenance. Although the smallest organizations make up not only most of the nonprofit universe, but also most of the entities in the nonprofit data universe, IRS data on them is a mess. Now, using evidence from two recent studies that include the smallest nonprofit organizations in the IRS Business Master File, that is the SLH Study of History Organizations and the Alliance for a California Traditional Arts Study of Folk and Traditional Arts and Ethnic and Cultural Organizations, we argue that leaving out the small organizations has important implications for equity in the sector. And the chapter presents three insights. I'm going to focus on just the third one, but I'll mention these other two. The first is that very, very small cultural organizations are disappeared in most data and analysis. That is, they are intentionally ignored or erased. The second is that devaluing very, very small organizations has implications for equitable access to good data, because only organizations represented by relatively powerful and highly resourced associations or advocates are able to generate data sets and the analysis that includes their organizations. And finally, that disappearing very, very small organizations has implications for how we recognize ethnic and racial diversity among nonprofits. And this is the one that I would like to focus on here because our time is short. I'll just elaborate this one. So the ACTA study coded, and I have to give Murray Kim, again, like kudos for her detailed and careful work doing that coding. The study coded each ethnic and cultural heritage organization in the data set with a tag for ethnic or racial affiliation. And this coding enabled detailed analysis of the ethnic and racial composition of affiliations in the subsector. We found that an accounting of the subsector that considers only organizations with annual revenue over $50,000 underrepresents Black African-American organizations. Among all ACTA organizations, 15% are Black African-American affiliated. However, among organizations with annual revenue over $50,000, only 9% are Black African American affiliated. An accounting of the subsector that considers only these larger organizations also underrepresents Native American affiliated and Southeast Asian affiliated organizations. Moreover, when only organizations with annual revenue over $50,000, these larger organizations are considered, Pan-Asian affiliated, Middle Eastern affiliated, Jewish affiliated, and North American affiliated organizations are overrepresented. Now, a solution to this problem is quite simple. Because there are so many of them, it's only necessary to include very, very small organizations in portrayals of the subsector to achieve a general rebalancing of the ledger. This is true even in the undercount of Black African American affiliated organizations, which shifts from 9% to 15% of the imputed total with the inclusion of the 644 very, very small Black African American affiliated organizations included in the ACTA dataset. Now, issues of magnitude need to be recognized here, of course. When the proportion of Native American affiliated organizations is undercounted by a difference of 1.15%, which you see here in this table, because the very, very small organizations have been disappeared, that may seem like just a trivial difference, but that percentage represents 251 Native American affiliated organizations, more than 8 times the number of organizations that shows up if only the larger organizations are counted. So let's consider a case where an activist, association, a funder, or a policymaker is trying to understand the scope of the nonprofit cultural infrastructure in order to assess service provision or find possible partners. That is a obvious use for these kinds of data. It's important that the view of the landscape for engaging in that sort of work is not distorted by a bias in the data. If a target population is Southeast Asian people, for example, or a target program focuses on Southeast Asian arts, culture, or heritage, it's important to know that there are 258 incorporated, registered, and active nonprofit Southeast Asian affiliated cultural organizations, and not just 21 that show up if you're only counting the larger organizations. And keeping in mind that in a typical inventory of organizations, ethnic affiliation will not be searchable, right? We're able to search that because we had the coding that Murray provided here. These would not show up. So in a typical inventory, Pan-Asian affiliated organizations appear especially prominent and numerous, and that sort of a view easily could lead to a faulty understanding of how well Pan-Asian organizations are situated in the nonprofit cultural ecology and how important or necessary they might be to serving a Southeast Asian population or program focus. Now, the national system for generating and maintaining data on nonprofit organizations provides a foundation for building data on nonprofit arts, culture, and humanities. But that foundation was not built for the cultural sector in particular. The IRS and NCCS data requires additional fitting to make a good tool for reporting and research in the cultural sector. And that work, of course, requires resources. Up until now, the quite significant resources that have been targeted to those purposes actually have exacerbated the tendencies of the national system to ignore smaller organizations. And this is particularly inopportune because the nonprofit cultural sector specifically includes a great deal, in fact, the greatest deal of relative income inequality among nonprofit arts, culture, and humanities organizations. So we have many, many very small and very few very, very, very large organizations within our subsector. Now, in our paper, we point to one solution, which is to simply include the smallest incorporated, registered, active nonprofit organizations in statistical portraits and analysis of the nonprofit arts, culture, and humanities, and also to be on guard for when we intervene in the data infrastructure to ensure that the impacts will not exacerbate this tendency to disappear or ignore smaller organizations. So for example, when NCCS employs automated coding, which it's tending to do now, and to incorporate more automation into its work, is it going to focus then on the programs of very large organizations while still ignoring smaller organizations? Or when Candid increases its focus on foundation-funded organizations and its attention to the data regarding those organizations, is that going to be supplemented with a parallel focus on cleaning the data for smaller organizations? Now, one thing I will report is that since we wrote this chapter, there has been a significant development, and that is the planning and funding of the National Inventory of Cultural Organizations. This is a project that is governed by a brand new mutual agreement between the National Endowment for the Humanities, the National Endowment for the Arts, and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, particularly the Humanities Indicators Project. It is funded by an unprecedented interagency agreement between NEH and NEA, and building this new data set that includes all of the organizations in the A code, as well as scraping the business master file for additional organizations, will be engaged by myself through IO Research along with Naval Vicaria, and we will be building that data set over the next couple of years. It will be publicly available by January 2027. If you want to see just the only press release, I think the only publicity on the project so far, this is a link where you can find it. So thank you so much, and I'm happy to answer any questions or looking forward to a discussion.
Great. Thanks, Carole.
Yes, my pleasure.
So I'm going to get the discussion started, which I feel a little weird about because I'm also one of the presenters. So Doug, I might be asking you questions and to put you on the spot a little bit. But so actually, Carole, you did a great job because your article not only looks at inequities, but it offers potential solutions. And then you even offered a potential solution in the form of NICO. So you are able to identify these innovations, these policy innovations that can directly address the issue that you bring up in your chapter. Doug, I feel like our chapter didn't do that quite so well. We sort of, presented the problems and didn't really provide the innovations. But if you read the rest of the book, I think a lot of those innovations are actually presented. So first I'm going to ask Carole, can you reiterate or maybe say, so what are the sort of the policy solutions or the policy innovations that you see could address this inequity in who actually shows up in the data for nonprofit cultural organizations?
Sure. Well, some of these are included in the way that we're planning for NICO. So one of them is to ensure that our definition of cultural organizations is very expansive, because a lot of what happens is that because people are most familiar with the arts in general and specific art forms, those norms get coded into the classifications and the way organizations get classified. So what happens is a lot of smaller organizations, and what I'm making my Gen X air quotes, marginal organizations, non-normative organizations, get put into like other categories because they're not recognized as being arts and cultural organizations. So pushing forward among policymakers, administrators, activists, advocates, a quite expansive view of what is included in the domain of cultural organizations is really important. A second important thing to do, actively do, is to, and this I hope it doesn't sound negative, but sort of be defensive, as I mentioned. So to look when we intervene in the data infrastructure, to be really careful that we aren't making changes that are going to amplify these problems, right? Or when changes happen, I think there really was not such an understanding or recognition when the IRS rules changed that, okay, now we're going to have 65% of the organizations that are not reporting very much financial data to us. And since we only report primarily on financial data, since the core file, right, that NCCS provides to the field only includes larger organizations, that means that 65% of the organizations in the file are going to get erased. So thinking about that. And then finally, this is sort of follows on from there, bringing together folks across the disciplines so that, and this is interesting in your description and thinking about how we understand institutions and what institutions mean, to know that, you know, many of the challenges that are faced by arts, culture, and humanities organizations are shared in common. And so the resources, the attention, the conversations need to happen across that broad expanse. And that the role of the public sector and the peak organizations is really important here, so that they are having conversations and seeing what they can do together rather than sort of staying in those silos, which we know has a long history from the culture wars and from the distribution of resources and the situatedness of the humanities in institutions of higher education. Like, there are lots of reasons why there is fragmentation, but building more opportunities and projects around concentration, you know, bringing these players together is really, really vital, really important way to innovate.
Great. Before I ask Doug his question, I want to also encourage everybody to put their questions in the chat or just raise your hand and ask questions. But I will ask Doug, I want to actually ask Doug the question that Attila puts at the end of his comment, which is this idea that, so salary cap. So the NBA has a salary cap, and they have restrictions on contracts for the star players. So quality there is also objective. So talent and quality is sort of the same thing across the sports market. How should this be regulated? So we talked a lot about superstar economies and the inherent inequality. So is this something that should be regulated in order to try to, right, prevent those inequalities from occurring? So how should this be regulated? Should this be regulated? And do we actually need overpaid superstars in the world? So I love that question, Attila.
I'm not sure they're overpaid to start off. I think we need to push on that. Arguably, the idea of salary caps are a construct of the owners in an attempt to underpay those superstars and cap their own expenses. So I'm not sure we're looking out for the right people on that. That said, you know, is Taylor Swift overpaid? And would I want to do something about it? I think more money that flows to her, probably the better. Let's just tax the hell out of it on the other end if that's what you're worried about. I wouldn't, you know, cap her revenues. I would just tax the heck out of them if that was the goal. I think superstar effects and superstar economics are so endemic across much of the arts, in part because identifying that and caring that much about the difference in talent between the best opera singer and the second best opera singer in the world. The marginal difference there, but all you're going to do is listen to one opera singer anyway, means the lion's share of the revenues is going to go to number one, and number two is going to be left with very little, and number 10 gets nothing. And I'm not sure that is a dynamic that's likely to change by regulatory force. And I'm not sure I like the sound of where that world would go anyway. I kind of want to embrace that and accept it as a weird reality. And maybe if you're worried about that, try to work on the demand side and train people to better differentiate. I don't think that's going to work. I think there's something we also on the demand side that matters. We like to have those sort of water cooler moments where we can share a common experience amongst people in the audience. And that's going to lead to superstar effects as well. We don't all want to listen to the different band. We all want to have something in common we can talk about. And so that's another challenge there to try to fight against that. I think you're better off on the back end doing sort of revenue wealth sharing. The other thing you can do is to help people with better identifying talent. Sometimes I don't care about what opera singer I listen to, so I just listen to the one everyone else is. And if you could get me to care differently, then maybe that helps. I'll end my response to this with two of my favorite, more technological, innovative approaches to thinking about Superstar. And a lot of this comes from a great book by Joel Waldfogel on the digital side of what's happened with larger platforms. And one of the thoughts is that sort of this long tail of the distribution thinking. Now we have access to more than just 3 TV channels, or I guess 1 if you were British. Now we have access to an unfortunate number of TV channels. We have too many streaming providers. There's a content overload. And in a world where there was only 1 TV channel and only 1 or 2 shows every evening, we had superstars and everyone else was left wanting for something. Now that we can access thousands of channels all the time, the notion of a hit show or a hit song is so much more dispersed. The peaks are smaller because we have 1,000 times more peaks. Mm-hmm. And so that's one innovative approach where technology is actually crushing some of these superstars that were there because of other structural issues. The other thing to think about is a lot of these technologies are doing a great job of helping us find talent that we weren't finding before. And so some of the overpaidness is being corrected because we're better able to find the good stuff that we want because the gatekeepers are changing and widening those gates. And if we can get better at finding the talent that we actually want, as opposed to being fed only one of 3 artists that we're forced to listen to, that can help spread the wealth as well. So widening the gates from those gatekeepers and technologically can go a long way to mitigating superstar effects. Those are just my off-the-cuff thoughts.
That's great. So I like this. We're pushing forward in terms of policy innovations, which is hard. We always sort of talk about the problems, but we don't ever get to the potential solutions. So this is what I want this series to try to look at. I want to go to Carlos's question in the chat. So it looks like it's for you, Carole, when he's wondering how the distribution of organizational size, I think, changes when you take into the account the size of the population in the geographical area where the organization is located.
Yeah, it's so interesting. The way I would respond to that question is to say that Neville and I have begun with the data that we already have from the 2 studies that have been completed to do a little bit of looking at those very small organizations. And what I will say is that whatever assumptions you might have about them, certainly the assumptions that I had about them do not appear to play out once we actually look at them. So this is a perfect example of why we actually need the data so we can look at where are small organizations. Is it that wealthier communities tend to have the most small organizations? Is it communities under pressure that have these sorts of organizations? We need to investigate that question, and the best way to do it, I think, at this point is by actually getting the data and digging down into it.
Doug, I think you have a question for Carole.
First off, Carole, thank you so much for doing this project and going for those small, hard to observe organizations. I only study the big ones because I have no justification for it other than that's the data. I don't want to assume that they don't matter. I want to test it, but I can't. I don't have the data. So it's so crucial that you're doing that great work. So first off, thank you. Secondly, the question is, I don't know, this is a framing thing maybe, but it's a bigger one. I want you to sort of riff on a possible trade-off between essentially reporting burden and getting data on smaller arts organizations or smaller organizations in general. I hear a lot of people in the arts world, think that reporting is an incredibly high burden for them, and it's a real cost that they have to pay when forced to do it. So how do we handle that?
Yeah, well, currently the project that we're working on does not require any additional reporting, right? It's just sending in the postcard and gathering the data from the 1027, so from the original registry document form. So I would think that what we're going to be able to do once we have this data set publicly available is that people who want to know more about these small organizations then will be able to devise research to go and look at them. So rather than saying to these organizations, now you need to do a whole bunch of new reporting, now, so the first phase of this project is to build the data set, and the second stage will be created. Then the data set will be released, but there will also be 2 years where a public interface platform is created. And so that will enable things like we are imagining for you to go into the data set and have a relatively easy interface where you can say, give me all the organizations that are tagged for like Southeast Asian arts, culture, and heritage, right? Then you're going to have that data set. And if you want to go find out some more about them, if you want to survey them and see what kind of response rate you get, then you can do that. Right now, you're not able to do that. So this absolutely does not necessarily entail any additional reporting. I will say, though, that one thing that would be so useful for the sector is to have peak organizations, public sector agencies, and advocates have every registered nonprofit go to GuideStar and check their NTEE code and see that their mission is actually posted there, the current version, because those are the most important data that we have right now. And organizations actually can be a part of that loop. They can go to GuideStar and check and see whether the information there is reflected appropriately. So that would take a relatively little bit of time and make a huge impact because so many of the smaller organizations are inaccurately coded or do not have up-to-date information from the time that they first registered until now.
Eric has a question, just I think about the data. So whether or not COVID relief money complicated understanding the small versus large organizations because of the large revenue fluctuations.
Yeah, so that's so interesting. And, you know, we are starting out by looking at every organization in the BMF. So if an organization went up 1 year and then drops back down, we will include them, and then we'll have to figure out how to report out on that. Like, is it a small one or a large one? And I honestly I don't think we have even discussed that. So that is a very good point. We will have to think about how to do that. We have realized that organizations have fluctuations in their revenue, and sometimes they will have to send a full Form 990 where for the past 10 or 12 years, they've only had to send a postcard, and just how anybody's going to grapple with that, I honestly don't know at the moment. But since we're not cutting anybody because they're small or large, we're including everyone. They will be in there. And then if somebody wants to figure out, like, for example, it would be really interesting to know how many organizations had to file a new Form 990 because of a COVID influx of revenue, and what new information do we have about those organizations that we didn't have before because they did not meet the threshold in years before, and now they met the threshold for 1 or 2 years after. That actually would be a totally great project, and somebody write that down for me, please, so that I don't forget that that's a good idea.
Great. I wanted to also touch on, Doug, the last thing you kind of mentioned, well, actually, I don't think it was on the slide, but you didn't really talk much about, was this idea of an incremental approach to innovation as opposed to this radical change. And I think a lot of what we're talking about today is actually very incremental. I mean, I think a lot of what Carole is pointing to are these are really, really small innovations that ultimately over the long run can make a huge change in how we understand the nonprofit sector, the nonprofit arts and cultural sector. I'm wondering, just Doug, if you can expand on that a little bit. Again, I get to pick on you because I'm the facilitator, even though I'm also co-author, but I don't need to answer the questions. You could have done the facilitator role too, and I would have had to answer. But so I'm just wondering if you could just talk about that a little bit, about the the perspective you see about radical versus incremental policy change in this sector?
Yeah, okay. Well, so in the sector, there's already a lot of arguably radical innovation happening sort of on it or at it through technological and other outside forces happening. It's a lot to combine that with, sort of a radical policy approach as well. Maybe you think we have to sort of fight fire with fire and respond in kind. With things have changed out there, so we really need to rebuild the whole system. But rebuilding a whole system is really hard, and our system, as broken as it is now, is there for a lot of hard-learned lessons along the way. And rebuilding that thing from scratch and taking a radical approach and sort of building it from the ground up is no small undertaking. And it's not just, oh, it's hard. It's also one where, as broken again as the system is, there's a lot of vested interests across the board that will fight tooth and nail to preserve a terribly flawed system. And you can full on count on this. So there's a feasibility question as well from a policy standpoint of trying to blow things up and start over again. One of the projects that we're working on, I think, would qualify as a radical sort of policy response, is looking at guaranteed income and like a universal basic income style programs. That's pretty radical in an American context, or really in a modern developed country context. It's huge. It's not a small deal, and understanding the implications of it and what's going to happen is big. The financing, all of that, is a really hard challenge, and being able to put all those pieces together is not obviously good for equity. It seems almost by definition, that one example is pro-equity, but a lot of the other more radical policies out there are going to do a lot to equity in ways that are maybe unintended or indirect. And I think one of the advantages of a more incremental approach is it lets you tease this out and muddle your way through and treat them as experiments and learn from them in order to better design the system and calibrate it to minimize any of the inequities that might inadvertently result.
Yeah, one thing I'll add to that too is I always think about policy and innovation in terms of what is good for sort of the overall system versus what is good for the individuals within that system, and what's necessarily good for the individuals within a system might not be good for the overall system, or vice versa. And so that's part of these unintended consequences we are constantly thinking about. Change the system, but a lot of people might get harmed along the way, or help the people in terms of guaranteed income, and the system as a whole might actually be even worse off.
Yeah, I wish I had like an amen button in Zoom for that. Partly because I think if you really want to take the radical approach to a more equitable system for art in the arts sector, almost everybody involved in the arts sector right now is out. They're done. They're fired, kind of thing. And we'd rebuild it from scratch. And that's politically infeasible, but also potentially unfair. Really, thinking of it this way, is like the people who are already working hard in this world would not necessarily have any kind of privileged position to remain in that world. There's no incumbent advantage in a more radical approach to these things. And that's, I think, makes for a tough reality that you might want to actually build it around what's already there for those kinds of fairness reasons as well. But maybe that's exactly why you want to blow it up too.
And to Tal's point in the chat, we actually, in our chapter, we take inequity to be synonymous with inequality, and that not all of the chapters do the same thing, so they define them differently. But we don't, like, those are two not necessarily the same things. We're really just talking about unequal access to particular types of resources based in the system. Carole, I'm going to give you the last question because you told me you had a question.
Okay, I have a question for you and Doug, and it sort of bounces off of what Tal said, and also how much I appreciate Doug bringing politics into the discussion. Both of these comments do. So my question is that I wonder if you imagine the ways in which discussing the structural inequalities of the system that we're in as natural. I can see how it's extremely helpful because it takes some of the heat out of how our attitudes toward people who are at the top or institutions that are at the top. But at the same time, how do we use that as an effective political tool to create more equity or equality, right? So it's so useful because it also highlights the problems. Like, these problems are sort of endemic to what we're dealing with. It's not necessarily only certain people's faults or the fault of certain histories, although those are influential. So I just wonder if you could comment on, how we might politically wield these ideas
Yeah.
in a productive way.
So the last paragraph of our chapter gets at this exactly, and maybe not as effectively as you would like, but we talk about how it's not enough to sort of villainize these institutions, right? Because of this idea that alternative innovations or alternative institutions or alternative systems might not be as good as we want them to look on paper. So there's always this idea that even when we villainize, we're always thinking about the grass is greener. However, in reality, the grass is not always greener, as we always know. We could be making the system even worse off. So I think that's one way to bring it into the politics, is that this heated discussion or this villainization of the systems is not actually productive in the fact that it's not considering what the alternative outcomes might produce as a result, right? So you sort of get a little bit, you get the point. So I think that's one way to do it. I think, what else would you say, Doug?
I don't know. I think it's a great point, a great question. I like the idea of not considering them natural systems, that they're sort of natural, but that they are the incumbent ones. And we're going to look at what we've got and see how can we make these better. There's a demand for making them better. It's not unlimited. It's a limited demand, but that's where incrementally we want to do things and make them better. And I think having the clear-eyed conversation about it, less villainizing, is going to go a long way to having a clear-eyed conversation. And I think you can look at things like natural monopolies, almost like utilities. And if we think the symphony is providing a utility, there's a lot of ways to approach. Well, what's an equitable financing scheme? Do we go after Taylor and make her pay? Do we go after smokers? Or do we actually do a block pricing system, the same as what we would do with water pricing in certain markets and how water delivery? Like, there are models out there, and we could put these things on the table and have conversations about what's an effective design in order to get us to the kind of outcomes we want. I do think, though, through all of this, it's better to see it more as an incremental thing or relative inequity, because at some level, perfect equity it's probably not even desirable. I don't want all my music to be equal. I want it to be different, right? So, like, there's at some really basic level, we want to just make the world better rather than rebuild it. Yeah. Great. Well, thank you all. That brings us to the end. And I want to, again, encourage you to reach out if you have any more if you have interest in the book, and I can share the flyer. But I also want to invite you to our second installment of the series.